Good morning and welcome to Global Shift, where we track the global transition away from the neoliberal world disorder towards a new emerging planetary order and help to unpack and make sense of the latest news and geopolitical events. This video is a sort of postscript to my last video and this article I wrote that was associated with it and published on the Global Shift website on the 8th of July. Both the video and the article were titled NATO Defeat in Ukraine. So although there's no associated article to this video, I intend here to speculate about future developments based on some of the facts established in that previous article. And the purpose of that previous article was to establish facts in a sort of historical survey which took us all the way in Russian history, almost from the time of Gorbachev all the way to the recent establishment of a fortified line by the Russians in Ukraine. And the discussion will go in three directions. The first direction is about how the article detailed how Russia quickly turned the Ukraine war into a defensive war in its second phase. I wrote about what I call an initial muscular negotiation phase of the war, and then a first storming phase of the war proper, which started with the siege of Mariupol. And then after that, we had the second phase, the second defensive phase of the war. This is where the Russians ultimately wanted to end up. In this second defensive phase, which I describe in part 1, section 4 of the article, multiple lines of fortifications were established, on which the Russians expected the Ukrainian army and its NATO controllers to impale themselves. And this is exactly what has happened. What I want to speculate about is phase 3 of the war, based on what we've learned so far. Namely, that the Russians invariably want to take a kind of ultimately a defensive posture. And given this, I believe Russia staying on the defensive will involve just doubling the length of the front line in order, respectively or concomitantly, to double the attrition rate of manpower and weaponry in Ukraine, in the Ukraine armed forces, and to thus completely exhaust the NATO effort. The second direction I want to take the discussion in refers to what I wrote about in the article in part 2, section 2, which was about the construction of the new Russian state that took place starting in the year 2000. This involved the interaction between elements of the Russian elite headed by figures from the liberal wing, like Kudrin and Medvedev, and from the right wing, like Patrushev, Sergin and Miller, and many others outside the Kremlin, like the head of the Communist Party, Gennady Zyuganov. In this picture, Vladimir Putin emerges as what is called a Bonapartist leader, the kind of leader whose power is derived from an ability to mediate and balance a number of conflicting political forces, ensuring stability in the country overall. The term actually comes from the way that Napoleon III Bonaparte ruled France from the time immediately after the 1848 revolutions until 1870. Sometimes the situation requires the marginalization, but never the elimination, of one of the leading figures in the elite, and elimination and marginalization by the consensus of all the others. And this is what happened actually to the pro-Western figure of Alexei Kudrin in 2011. Western media's depiction of Putin as an autocratic Tsar, like, say, Ivan the Terrible, is totally misleading. You can see this attitude in their invention of the sobriquet for Yevgeny Prigozhin when they call him Putin's cook. In fact, Prigozhin is a powerful actor within the Russian elite in his own right. And his survival after his public brawl with the Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu, that took the form of a rebellion, wasn't about Putin being gracious at all. It was that the various interests around Putin saw value in continuing with Wagner, albeit that its presence within Russia should be wound down. And now that the political conditions in West Africa have seen a sudden dramatic shift, we begin to see the relevance of Wagner all of a sudden again. And the third direction that I'd like to take the discussion in is about the overall geopolitical situation. And this will actually be followed up with several new videos and articles in the coming weeks and months. In this regard, John Mearsheimer published another brilliant critical article called The Darkness Ahead, Where the Ukraine War is Headed, on his Substack page. Mearsheimer has been, as everybody knows, extremely critical of NATO expansion, like Stephen Cohen before him, and others like Jeffrey Sachs, and even during the Clinton administration, when NATO expansion started, Defense Secretary William Perry, the inventor of modern logistical warfare, not to mention William Burns, the current CIA director, all these people predicted that the Ukraine war would happen, and that it was an avoidable and stupid mistake by US and European foreign policy elites. And on the Global Shift website, I take a position consistent with these views, that the Ukraine war was a catastrophic, self-immolating decision by the United States and its comatose Western partners. I disagree slightly with Mearsheimer's current position, however, that war will involve a long-term stalemate. There are different ways of looking at this war to see where it's going, but probably an interesting way of doing so, which doesn't exhaust any of the other perspectives, is rather than the proxy war by the United States against Russia, it might be useful to look at it as the proxy war waged by China against the United States, a war that, furthermore, is costing China nothing. So let's go to the first point, the first direction I want to go in, discussing what I believe the third phase of the Ukraine war will look like. This, I don't believe, will take the form of a massive Russian offensive to take more of Ukraine. The war has been waged from the start with an economy of effort. And this despite the fact that Russia, besides having the largest nuclear arsenal in the world, that Russia has the requisite manufacturing-based manpower and cultural system to prevail in any conventional land war against the United States today. When I say Russia's cultural system, I mean the ability of the Russian state to run a system of widespread military conscription among its very large 150 million population, something which Western nations cannot do, and which Western elites, dogged by nightmares of the Vietnam protests, are very fearful of instituting. Hence, all the proxy wars we've had. The success of the second phase of the war for the Russians has meant that they would want to give Ukraine and NATO more of the same in the third phase. Although the initial part of the third phase will look like an offensive because it's starting off, its purpose will be to incite a counteroffensive in which Russia would plan for the Ukrainian attrition rate to rise to unbearable levels. The ultimate purpose will be to wait out, or to wait not just for the collapse of Ukraine, but for the collapse of the entire current Western order, given that NATO countries decided at the Vilnius summit to give everything they have for a defeat of Russia, other than including Ukraine in NATO. I'll come back to this in my third point. So what are the signs that this is the way things are going? The military summary channel, which is run by the Belarusian military analyst Dima, commented on the 13th of July on the dismissal of the Russian general Ivan Popov, who headed the Russian 58th Combined Arms Army in the Zaporizhia sector of the front line, and who was central to the defeat of the Ukrainian counteroffensive in June. Dima's take on the matter at the time, which starts 1 minute into the 13th of July video, linked in the description box below, was that this was due to internal ministerial politics. In fact, there was a wave of dismissals of various generals at the time, which the Wall Street Journal also on the 13th of July interpreted as a purge undertaken in the wake of the Prigozhin Wagner rebellion, link in the description box below. However, things are just not what they seem, are they? Along with Ivan Popov, some of the other Russian generals supposedly fired were Sergei Surovikin, head of the Ukraine theater, Andrei Yudin, ex-head of the Russian Aerospace Forces, and Vladimir Alexeyev, ex-head of Russian military intelligence, the GRU. These and others constituted a list of some of the most highly decorated, successful and popular military figures in Russia. None of it made sense. Dima returned to the subject on the 16th of July after he realized this, and also after he realized the complementarity that existed between the skills of all the different generals. So in a new video, he surmised that if Russia wanted to build an entirely new army and do so stealthily, away from the gaze of satellites, it could only do so under the cover of the routine spring mobilization that was taking place, that was taking place anyway this year, which involved drafting 147,000 new soldiers into the Russian army. And those generals that had been fired would in fact seem to constitute the very best staff to organize such an army. The discussion on this in the video starts at 0.37 minutes into the video and lasts for 12 minutes, all linked in the description box below. The current aggressive posture, actually, of the Russians in the far northeastern sector of the front line between Kupiansk and Liman, suggests that a new army may indeed open up a new front line beyond that, above the Kharkiv region. So going to the second point about how the war seems to be spreading to Africa. Now, all of this, what I've just talked about, the recruitment of a new army and so on and so forth, is taking place under the cover of massive publicity related to the redeployment of Wagner forces to Belarus. We see a 15th of July video, for instance, about how the Wagner's forces in Belarus held an open day for the media. Starts 1.29 minutes into the video and is linked in the description box. I mean, so much has been made of Wagner in Belarus over and over, and yet we know that the Wagner group has always been a tool of the Russian state, created by Russian military intelligence, the GRU, for operations basically in Africa. This all began in 2012 and 2013, when Wagner was still trading under the name of Moran Security, and whose job at the time was to protect Russian commercial interests in the Nigerian oil sector. There's a big scandal involved with that, and so on and so forth, but I won't go into that here. And most famously, it operated in Libya, supporting renegade Libyan General Khalifa Haftar who was based in Benghazi in Libya's second civil war between 2014 and 2020. And this in an attempt to re-establish the Russian interests, which were lost in the NATO 2011 bombing and the fall and murder of Libyan leader Gaddafi, events that totally took the Russians by surprise. Given all of this, and the fact that Prigozhin seems to have been extremely active during the Russia-Africa summit in St. Petersburg between the 27th and the 28th of July this year, I put an article in the description box below about that. One would think that all that Belarusian publicity must be hiding something. At the Russia-African summit, Putin announced the forgiving of $23 billion worth of debt to African countries and the provision of between 25,000 and 50,000 metric tons of grain free of charge and without any delivery costs to the Africans over the next 3 or 4 months. Again, articles are linked in the description box below. EU Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell was clearly spooked by these developments, and he warned African countries not to accept the Russian grain. Again, the article is in the description box. Indeed, it was the West's blockage of the Russian demand for sanctions on its grain exports to be lifted, which it wanted in exchange for allowing Ukraine to export its own grain, that has led to the current pass, where the Russians have begun to block Ukrainian exports. During the Russia-Africa summit, the pro-Western leadership of Niger, which did not attend the summit, was toppled by a military coup. Now this follows a recent pattern in West African countries, Mali and Burkina Faso and so on, where intense dissatisfaction has built up over the exploitative and divisive role of France and the United Nations in the region. At the end of another video, a 1st of August video, towards 29.59 minutes into the video, again in the description box below, we see Niger announcing a cessation of supplies of uranium to France, a material which France clearly depends on for its large nuclear power generating capacity. Niger, furthermore, was supposed to be a transit site for new oil and gas pipelines to the Mediterranean from Nigeria. This is all now very unlikely. In a 3rd of August video, also in the description box, we learn 2.43 minutes into the video how pro-Russian elements took over in Niger. And after 7 minutes into the video, how the leaders of Niger and Burkina Faso met to discuss the possible rapid deployment of Wagner forces on their territory. Something besides which is supported by Mali and Senegal. So there's a group of countries there that are united, that have developed a united stand against French, US and UN intervention, and are asking the Russians to intervene, a bit like Assad did in Syria. Note that when you watch these videos, actually the narrator of the video is Dima. He keeps calling Niger Nigeria, but he means Niger, so pay attention to that. In fact, the last video, the 3rd of August video, is slightly confusing and goes backwards and forwards between the different possible deployments of Wagner forces. It's all very interesting, but I believe that all the different moves by the different small elements of the Wagner forces are intended to confuse and to provide cover for what the real Russian plans are for the future. We come now to the third point about the overall geopolitical situation. Following his article on Substack, John Mearsheimer appeared in an interview with Aron Maté, linked in the description box below. Do watch it. It's a great interview. Two great people. I agree with Mearsheimer's take that because the Russians are winning the conventional war, there is, exactly as I say in my last article, little risk of nuclear war. I also agree that the Russians will be playing, as he says, hardball, and will be seeking to turn Ukraine into a dysfunctional state to control it. But Mearsheimer does say that it is possible that the Russians will seek to do this by taking an additional 4 provinces, or oblasts as they're called in Ukraine, in addition to the 4 that they have already annexed into Russia proper. I do think, however, that given what my last article describes as the modus operandi of the current Russian leadership, which is one of economy of effort, Russia will probably not do this. They will seek to drive Ukraine, as it stands now in its reduced form, together with the its NATO Western backers, into a situation over time of total despair, however long that takes. The aim is clearly to try and cause a change of government in what remains of Ukraine, and presumably accompanying changes of government in Western countries. Controlling large cities in Ukraine like Kharkiv and Odessa, even if they have ethnic Russian populations, is unlikely to be something the Russians would want to do. The argument in my last article is that while Crimea was essential to the survival of the Russian state, its dependence on hydrocarbons and its energy policy, the acquisition of the 4 oblasts already annexed, which are Luhansk and Donetsk and Zaporozhye and Kherson, was done essentially to protect Crimea. In fact, they are essential if you want to protect Crimea. But they would probably not want to go beyond that, because that would cause too many Russian casualties and cost too much. As for the discussion between Aron Maté and John Mearsheimer about new fronts in the war between NATO and Russia opening up, they discuss a Polish front, a Black Sea front, a Baltic front, and an Arctic front. But although now there's definitely a Black Sea front, since the new Russian blockade and the end of the grain deal, the UN-administered Ukraine grain deal, all we see is a development actually of a new African front. The most important thing that I believe is on the cards in the overall geopolitical situation, which is likely to change dramatically over the next couple of years, is that all this talk of fronts, which suggests that we have continuing 2 competing power blocks covering the globe that will last, is not, I don't think, what is going to happen. I don't think, to be brief, that the United States will stay the course. And this for 3 main reasons. That will be the subject of forthcoming videos. The first reason is the fact that the United States is divided. The current political environment is as near a circus as one could possibly imagine. Trump is now subject to many indictments, which in theory should land him in jail. But it seems that the more indictments he gets, the higher he rises in the polls. Biden, meanwhile, is the only candidate that the Democratic National Congress will allow to run in the Democratic nomination in a 2024 race. Yet he is also likely to be indicted on a number of corruption charges. Plus, he's clearly mentally incapable. I mean, if Biden wins the presidency in 2024, we will have the continuation of a president in power who is increasingly comatose. Ironically, like Leonid Brezhnev after his series of strokes in 1976, Biden will be under the influence of a tightly knit mafia that obviously includes figures in the American security state that don't want to let go of power. In fact, Brezhnev's comatose rule is what actually led to the economic decline in the Soviet Union. You'd be interested to know the ultimate irony, that actually Brezhnev himself was a Ukrainian from Dnipropetrovsk, as it was called by the Russians, or Dnipro by the Ukrainians, and that the people who ran the USSR while he was incapacitated were all part of the Dnipropetrovsk mafia, which included Konstantin Chernenko, who became the last Soviet leader before Gorbachev took over with his ill-fated reforms. A situation like this has never occurred in American history and is occurring now as America pays the price for the neoliberal plutocracy that it allowed the corporate liberals to build from the 1970s onwards. The second reason why I think America went to the course has to do with China. If America is a neoliberal empire, the core of its production capacity is located in China. American multinationals don't want to leave China. It's as simple as that. No other developing country has China's skills and market depth. Not Mexico nor Vietnam, both which come second and third after China in world trade terms. China has a greater than 60% global penetration in 500 crucial internationally traded goods. While the Biden administration may want to strangle China's chip capacity, all it will do is to strangle the many firms that are now being coerced not to trade with China, and that will lose over 30% of their sales as a result. Now think about this. If China is a lethal antagonist for America, it is because, like in the Alien films, it is an antagonist that has erupted from the very bowels of the neoliberal system. And while American politicians and business leaders queue up to visit a smiling, benign, avuncular Xi Jinping almost on a weekly basis now, including Bill Gates and Elon Musk and, besides Janet Yellen and so on, almost, all of them trying to see if China couldn't possibly join the Western camp against Russia. It is worth considering the view that China itself might have lit the fuse in Ukraine, and as some would describe it, is actually conducting a Chinese proxy war against the United States. I link an interesting article on this below in the description box. So America is paying the price for the neoliberal betrayal and abandonment of its own local workforce and its historic industrial legacy. Its abandonment of this decades ago, an irreplaceable legacy. The third reason that I don't think the United States can stay the course is that the federal government is phenomenally indebted. At the same time that foreigners, especially China, are increasingly reducing their investments in its debt instruments. Besides, one of the most important sources of liquidity in the international money markets used to be Russia, until, that is, the United States has destroyed that source, cutting its nose to spite its face. The figures now show that the Federal Reserve is increasingly having to take up the slack. Although domestic private investment in treasuries is rising, obviously as interest rates rise, there's more interest by pension funds. The Fed will be indispensable in funding the growing gap now that there is a tsunami of treasuries coming to the market. How is it going to do that while also controlling inflation? An analysis of the fiscal and monetary situation in the United States will be forthcoming in a video with an accompanying article in the next few weeks. The United States is a powerful nation, but these three pressures, along with an acknowledged military weakness which is hidden under the fog of an astronomical defense budget, which is the main cause of the deficit, a budget that has besides never been and never could be certified by auditors, will mean that it will be forced to seek compromises with its antagonists sooner rather than later. And it would seem that Europe will be the sacrificial lamb. So for a full analysis of these issues, including sources, please read the last article published on globalshift.com, which I refer to here, and to the links in the video description box below. Thank you for listening.